Imagine booting up Windows 95 and finding a screensaver you've never heard of, something called 3D Workers Island. Today, we're stepping back in time to unravel its quiet, unsettling mystery. Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. From its first appearance as a mysterious freeware discovery on a Windows 95-era website, 3D Workers Island emerges quietly and without fanfare. The old-style portal called 3D Screensavers Palace hosts an unknown program labeled 3DWI.scr, purportedly featuring 6 characters who inhabit a small, self-contained island. Visitors to the page find step-by-step instructions, how to download the installer at the measured pace of a dial-up connection, how to run the executable, watch progress bars fill, and review a README file that offers only a faint hint of what lies ahead. The text mentions workers' simulation without much elaboration, other than to say that workers are an approach to computation, and that this approach uses resources in the world. Further, we are introduced to the cast: Pat, Rebecca, Joe, Amber, Holland, Grace. With the setup complete, the screensaver's world comes into view. A tiny island set in a boundless ocean, a modest red house perched on its surface, a picnic table, a few trees, and patches of flowers. At first, nothing dramatic occurs. Joe tends to the flowers along the shore. Amber steps out of the red house and looks on. Later, the others, Holland, Pat, Grace, and Rebecca, are seen standing, sitting, or performing other fairly unremarkable tasks. Grace often seems isolated from the rest of the group. Rebecca seems responsible for the cooking. Holland seems to be a toddler. Their movements are simple and repetitive. In these early glimpses, the island's existence seems peaceful, if perhaps a bit inscrutable. Yet, even here, the absence of sound and the characters' minimal gestures quietly invite the viewer to pay closer attention. This silence is said to evoke a ghostly transience, encouraging a deep, iterative form of observation, where the slightest change can feel significant. Yet, the screensaver's world does not exist in isolation. Soon we encounter another layer of the narrative, a community of forum users from 1999. Their commentary reframes our understanding of the island and its silent inhabitants. A small community of intrigued users discuss their impressions. This post from a user named MawGirl, who is enthusiastic about the screensaver, describing it as mesmerizing. She says she wants to leave it on all day to see what the characters on the island are doing. User 12 Point shares a critique of 3DWI, mentioning bugs and oddities, while humorously berating his roommate who claims he could program it better. This user seems interested in the screensaver from a technical standpoint. User Homer provides a softer, more personal note describing how his mother, despite disliking TV, finds comfort in watching the virtual people of 3DWI on a projector. For Homer's mother, the screensaver has an escapist function. Earl Egger brings a contrasting viewpoint, expressing boredom and confusion. Earl Egger's complaint about the characters lacking faces speaks to a lack of expressiveness, making it difficult for him to connect with the program on an emotional level. Each of these users engages with the screensaver in a different way, based on their particular interests and backgrounds. The difference in reactions, ranging from enthusiastic immersion to outright skepticism, mirrors the kind of communal speculation that once surrounded works like Petscop, where audience members collectively puzzled over unclear meanings. Here, the forum's various voices form a microcosm of discourse. Some approach the program as a technical curiosity, some embrace it as ambient escapism, and others dismiss it as completely pointless. Users begin reporting oddities, characters appearing in unsettling arrangements. As participants continue to debate the screensaver's significance, rumors begin to swirl about other, more subversive sources of information, places where darker theories and unsettling implications surface. References to a different website, an alternative source of information, circulate, only to be suppressed by the forum's administrator, Pat Lawler, who polices the discourse to ensure the discussion remains clean. This growing tension suggests that the initial simplicity is deceptive, a facade concealing hidden depths. The structure of these interactions highlights a key insight. 3D Workers Island is not only about what happens on the island, but also about how viewers interpret it, what they bring to it, and how they debate its meaning with one another. In other words, the program becomes a catalyst for community-driven narrative construction, with the forum's discussion functioning as a second layer of the text itself. These strange details, when pieced together, point towards an underlying pattern of decay and stress within the system, what some have come to call worker degeneration. The notion of worker degeneration, tied specifically to Amber, emerges as a recurring mystery. Amber's occasional transformation into a small red sphere and the appearance of these compressed remnants gathered in a wheelbarrow raises the specter of something distressing embedded within the program's placid routines. While this concept of worker degeneration remains puzzling to some degree, it would suffice to say at this point that it serves as a gateway to various abstract themes. The work invites us to consider the nature of labor, routine, and exploitation hidden beneath the screensaver's tranquil exterior. Layer by layer, the text reveals a multiplicity of interpretations. Is the island a neutral simulation or a site of veiled horrors? Are viewers meant to see these characters as laborers bound to repetitive tasks, their work both mundane and essential to some undisclosed system? The repeated references to worker simulation hint at a commentary on labor, routine, and exploitation beneath the polite veneer of a screensaver. At the same time, the incomplete explanations, restricted links, and fleeting anomalies manufacture an illusion of depth, an entire hidden archive of inside information that remains tantalizingly out of reach. Through these methods, 3D Workers Island underscores an important insight. The absence of explicit guidance amplifies the sense of enigma. With so many pages and possibilities alluded to but not shown, the viewer is compelled to revisit and reinterpret, gradually discovering that the meaning resides not simply in what the text presents, but in what it withholds. Due to the subtlety of the work, rereading is a highly rewarding experience. Much like the layered enigmas of Petscop, 3D Workers Island invites multiple passes, each unveiling new angles. Silence, minimal cues, and repetitive scenes become tools for sparking curiosity. The viewer's understanding evolves as they piece together hints from the island and forum discussions, forging their own interpretations that may or may not align with those of other participants. This iterative engagement and the community engagement it inspires is another crucial insight, one that speaks to how digital works can foster collective analysis, blurring the line between observer and participant. As these interpretive layers accumulate, the story's climax forces a reckoning with its deeper meaning. By the final chapter, the narrative takes a decisive turn. Bold red text announces a recession of the islands, and we witness a wheelbarrow tipping the red spheres, Amber's degenerated remnants, into the sea. The viewer's perspective withdraws, the entire island shrinking to a pinpoint until it vanishes completely. Multiple simultaneous instances of the screensaver appear and then collapse into a uniform red screen. Here, all prior complexity melts away into stark emptiness, forcing a reflection on impermanence and the fragility of these virtual constructs. The last frame, stating 3D Workers Island, a thing, by Tony Domenico, leaves the viewer with a memory of quiet labor, odd interruptions, secret codes of behavior, and the potent influence of communal speculation. The phrase thing acts as a deliberate rejection of narrative closure, refusing to encapsulate 3D Workers Island within a single definitive label. Is it a story, a screensaver, a forum, a website, a webcomic? The word thing resists the reductive impulse to impose a tidy framework or genre onto the work, leaving it suspended in ambiguity. This description reflects the fragmented collective experience of engaging with the work, leaving interpretation perpetually open-ended. Faced with this stark conclusion, we must revisit the scattered clues, the silences, and the hidden codes to understand what 3D Workers Island truly conveys. In this final moment, the best insights crystallize. The work's complexity reveals itself not only in the slow accumulation of odd occurrences, but in the interplay between what is shown, what is hidden, and how viewers respond. The parallels to Petscop affirm that this is indeed a spiritual sequel. The work's effect is quite similar, except this time, an additional layer of discursivity is cleverly employed to spur collective engagement and layered interpretation. The forum exchanges illuminate how narratives are shaped communally, with multiple users approaching the same stimuli through different lenses. Meanwhile, the recurring motif of labor, the so-called workers tending to flowers, cooking meals, mowing lawns, provides a thematic anchor around which questions of purpose, exploitation, and meaning revolve. The quiet, soundless world and the absence of direct explanations ensure that everything must be read carefully and revisited again and again, drawing the viewer deeper into its enigmatic depths. 3D Workers Island, the screensaver, stands as an intricate artifact that, through its opaque simplicity and the complexity of its reception, invites sustained reflection on narrative, interpretation, and the subtle art of uncovering meaning. Yet the process of sifting through these shifting perspectives and textual silences does not end there. Beyond the initial journey into the island's routines and the community's half-whispered suspicions, subsequent explorations introduce a more nuanced dimension. Characters like Pat Lawler, who rigidly polices discussions and embodies a position of wealth and free time, highlight the intersecting themes of class, moral authority, and interpretive control. At the same time, details such as Amber's supposed laziness are directly contradicted by her visible acts of labor, such as mowing the lawn. This raises doubts about the reliability of any single viewpoint, especially that of the forum's most influential voices. In the midst of these contested narratives, a new metaphor emerges, an invented skin disease called kutilikune, that encapsulates the process of stripping away layers of meaning until only raw essence remains. This kutilikune is a term borrowed from another one of Domenico's works, a short story called Good Sky. Just as this imaginary ailment reduces the body to layers of exposed flesh, the narrative methodically peels back its own surface. What initially seems like a benign screensaver dissolves into a tangle of contested interpretations and uncanny insinuations. Forum users consistently encourage wider adoption of the program, urging each other to run it across multiple machines for extended durations, as though the screensaver itself seeks propagation and continuous engagement. To state the obvious, it spreads in a viral fashion. Here, the work suggests that meaning thrives not in tidy revelations, but in prolonged communal entanglement, where every new detail, be it a silent gesture on the island or a half-suppressed forum rumor, modifies the evolving texture of the story. In short, as the narrative deepens, 3D Workers Island confronts the reader not only with layers of hidden information, but with the dynamics of power, class, gatekeeping, and the collective creation of meaning. By demonstrating how individuals project their personal frameworks, be they moral, technical, or escapist, onto the same sparse material, the work exposes a delicate ecosystem of narrative formation. Each interpretive thread intertwines with another, producing an intricate web of references and refutations, trust and skepticism, longing and dismissal. Much like the elusive worker simulation that powers the island's silent inhabitants, the full force of these insights emerges only through persistent, attentive observation. As one delves further, new complexities emerge. Anxieties about forbidden topics, swiftly censored by Pat Lawler, reveal that interpretive freedom is not absolute. The forum's governing hand ensures that certain conversations, especially those revolving around ambiguous fan theories tied to Amber, are kept at bay. In this way, 3D Workers Island foregrounds the notion that authority figures and social hierarchies shape what can and cannot be discussed. The interplay of moral prescriptions, wealth, and leisure, exemplified by Pat's multiple PCs running the screensaver around the clock, imparts a dynamic of class and control that influences the community's exploration. Meanwhile, factions arise within the forum's membership. Some users embrace innocuous interpretations, and still others sardonically joke about these darker storylines, warning newcomers not to become another one of us. This stratification reflects how audiences parse cryptic digital works, with rumor and speculation spawning subcultures fixated on obscure clues. It mirrors the real-world phenomenon of fan communities dividing into camps and forging their own distinctive myths, all from the same minimal source material. Such disagreements point to a central tension. The deeper one goes, the more the story fragments into rival theories, uneasy truces, and escalating suspicions. A detailed analysis of 3D Workers Island reveals a striking fractal structure underpinning occurrences on the island in relation to user interactions on the forum. Early engagement exhibits clear patterns of curiosity as initial queries branched into increasingly intricate subthreads. This recursive process of exploration and collapse mirrors the iterative cycles of occurrences within the screensaver itself, drawing participants into a surreal meta experience they scarcely recognize. The alignment between the forum's dynamics and the screensaver's narrative becomes increasingly unsettling upon closer inspection. Threads fixating on the Amber conspiracy soon spiral into absolute chaos. Those users obsessed with decoding Amber's degeneration were later dubbed Amber shitheads by a certain skeptic. If this AIM conversation is any indication, these fan theorists apparently grew increasingly disruptive, generating a flood of argumentative noise that eventually destabilized the entire community. Their relentless speculation apparently drove the site's admins to take the 3D WI discovery pages offline permanently. Ruined a good thing, says this observer. This collapse was not just an isolated event, it eerily mirrors the inescapable collapse of the screensaver itself. Just as Amber's repetitive cycle of labor accumulates in the accumulation of inert red spheres of falseness, so too does the forum slowly become weighed down by its own argumentative detritus. What began as a space for curiosity and collective inquiry devolved into ideological infighting, choking out meaningful discussion until the entire structure could no longer sustain itself. Yet, in both the screensaver and the forum, collapse is never the end. The AIM conversation itself points towards the fact that speculation around the screensaver is still ongoing, and therefore users are still out there running the software on their own systems. The hellish process of degeneration is still being perpetuated to this day. Through this fractal interplay of cycles of flourishing, collapse, and reconstitution, the forums didn't merely discuss the narrative of 3D Workers Island, they unintentionally replicated it. Their recursive patterns of creation and decay become an unwitting extension of the screensaver's world, collapsing the boundaries between text and discourse, fiction and reality. The introduction of Kutilakune, especially vis-a-vis the delineation of the disease's progressive stages, serves as both metaphor and narrative device, symbolizing the gradual stripping away of layers until nothing remains but raw, vulnerable essence. The disease's presence suggests that understanding 3D Workers Island requires peeling back countless interpretive skins. Some characters' supposed laziness or questionable motives, the persistent push to install and observe the screensaver on more and more machines, or the grim hints of hidden violence. Far from offering closure, these revelations reveal how meaning emerges only through collective struggle and perpetual reconsideration. The ongoing process of interpretation, of interpreting scant data, inferring conspiracies, and oscillating wildly between suspicion and dismissiveness, transforms the screensaver's sparse imagery into a cultural artifact shaped by its audience. Censorship, internal feuds, and the clash of innocence with insinuated horrors ensure that the experience of 3D WI is never static. Instead, like the worker simulation seemingly powering the island's inhabitants, understanding comes only from sustained, attentive, ever-renewed engagement. After multiple readings and careful observation, I've developed a pet theory. 3D Workers Island isn't just a screensaver simulation, it's a digital recreation of a real blended family. Each character's psychological profile appears to be baked into the system's architecture, expressed as attributes of their respective digital embodiments. These profiles not only shape individual behaviors, but also govern the dynamics between characters, creating recurring patterns of interaction that seem too deliberate to be random. Of course, this is my own projection, shaped by the patterns I see emerging from the characters' various interactions. Whether these patterns are truly encoded or simply an elaborate coincidence is impossible to say, but they resonate deeply, creating an uncanny sense of realism. Amber and Holland, the most explicitly connected pair within the system, exhibit a tension that feels eerily authentic to the dynamics of older and younger siblings. When Amber and Holland interact in this scene, the encounter ends with Holland departing, perhaps to tattle on Amber, reinforcing the impression of a younger sibling's need for validation and an older sibling's frustration with being constantly surveilled. Consequently, we see Pat, who is strongly insinuated to be their mother, reprimand Amber behind the red house. It's not just scripted behavior, it feels more like the psychological residue of a family dynamic rendered into code. Let's talk about Joe. In the very first scene, Joe's attention to his beloved flowers speaks volumes. While other characters engage in occasional interactions, Joe appears to retreat into solitary labor as a means of avoiding interaction. His gardening isn't just a task, it's an act of psychological self-preservation, a way of distancing himself from the group's latent tensions. This behavior could suggest a character modeled after someone who habitually withdraws to avoid emotional entanglements, seeking solace in routine and productivity instead. Grace, who often appears isolated, adds another layer of complexity. Her apparent neurodivergence, hinted at through her difficulty with connecting with other characters as well as her inability to make eye contact with the camera, seems to create a barrier between her and the rest of the group. While the screensaver provides no explicit diagnosis, her portrayal feels authentic to the experience of social exclusion often faced by neurodivergent individuals. Grace's solitude is not self-imposed, but rather an emergent property of the group dynamic, as though the other characters are subtly conditioned to keep their distance. Pat's role within the system is perhaps the most striking. She exudes the air of a narcissistic, emotionally immature authority, reminiscent of a boomer matriarch clinging desperately to control. Her interactions are marked by self-centeredness and a lack of emotional nuance, suggesting a character whose internal world revolves around maintaining a fragile sense of superiority. Pat's portrayal feels so specific and lived in that it's hard not to imagine her as the digital double of someone the creator of the software once knew, perhaps even a mother or a family friend. By embedding these psychological profiles into the architecture of the system, 3D Workers Island transcends its digital trappings. It becomes a ghostly simulation of human relationships, where patterns of real-world interactions echo endlessly in the sterile confines of a virtual island. Of course, I recognize that this theory says as much about me as it does about the screensaver, and if you're writing a comment right now about why I'm wrong, you're missing the point. These interpretations are shaped by my own experience of human behavior. Whether these characters were deliberately designed to embody such a psychological specificity, or whether I'm simply mapping my own framework onto them, is ultimately unknowable, and that's the point. That ambiguity, the question of whether the patterns I see are intentional or accidental, is part of what makes 3D Workers Island so compelling. It becomes more than a digital artifact. It feels more like a haunting reflection of real human relationships, with echoes of recognizable dynamics playing out over and over and over again. The human mind, much like the system running 3D Workers Island, is a black box. We observe its outputs, patterns, behaviors, and interactions, but its inner workings remain obscured and ultimately unknowable. This is visually represented by the red, windowless house that looms on the island. Its impenetrable walls suggest an architecture of containment, a structure designed to keep its contents sealed away from prying eyes. We can only speculate about what happens inside, just as we can only guess at the internal logic driving these digital characters' actions. The house then becomes a stand-in for the phenomenon of the black box, whether human or digital, hinting at depths we cannot access, a hidden truth that shapes the visible world. The red house sits in quiet defiance of our desire to know, much like the system itself refuses to clarify whether the patterns we perceive are intentional, emergent, or purely our own projections. The red house, in its silent opacity, resists resolution, forcing us to grapple with the limits of our own understanding, what can be known, and what must be imagined. This tension mirrors the very experience of engaging with the work itself, where every attempt to impose meaning feels like an act of intrusion, pulling us deeper into the work's unsettling ambiguity. The narrative of 3D Workers Island intricately weaves themes of fiction and reality, presenting a layered metacommentary on the interpretive tendencies of audiences engaging with enigmatic works like Petscop. A central motif in this work is the unsettling transition between fiction and reality. Any movement across this metacontextual boundary is invariably interpreted as an act of violence. This framing simultaneously deepens the work's eerie ambience while serving as a critique of how narratives are consumed and interpreted, creating the uncanny sensation that even attempting to make sense of it carries some level of moral weight. And yet, the mind cannot help to infer meaning from patterns. This renders us all complicit by virtue of our own cognitive faculties. The depiction of the PJR pin formation, for example, with its strict and specific requirements, underscores the emergence of urban legends within the screensaver's fanbase. This discourse mirrors real-world fandom dynamics, specifically in the context of speculative, internet-based storytelling. As fans document and embellish phenomena like the PJR pin formation, their accounts gain legitimacy within the fictional universe, despite their questionable veracity. This phenomenon aligns with the work's metacommentary on how communities create their own mythologies to explain ambiguous or unresolved narrative elements. The PJR pin formation, in which the character known as Amber is immobilized by three other characters, culminates in a sequence of events laden with ominous undertones. The ambiguity surrounding these events heightens their disturbing nature, leveraging the audience's imagination to fill in the gaps. This narrative device reflects the way fandoms often extrapolate theories from limited information, forming a collective but sometimes divergent understanding of the work. The concept of worker degeneration introduces a chilling transformation. Amber, the central figure, undergoes a process of compression, eventually reduced to a silent, inert red sphere. This transformation is interpreted as a manifestation of dehydration, malnutrition, or mutilation, physical and symbolic acts of violence. The recurring cycle where Amber respawns only to face the same fate over and over again evokes a Sisyphean horror emblematic of broader themes of exploitation and systemic dehumanization. The description of Amber's compression resonates with themes of ontological disintegration over time, as her identity as a so-called worker is reduced to mere waste, a lifeless object discarded in the narrative's digital abyss. This process is laden with implications about the flattening and commodification of individual agency, specifically in systems that reduce human effort to mere functionality. One of the most striking aspects of this particular segment is its meta-commentary on the audience's role in shaping the narrative. The explicit connection between worker degeneration and the audience's theorizing suggests a deliberate critique of how interpretive communities impose frameworks onto ambiguous works. The authorial voice oscillates between acknowledging the discourse and maintaining a level of ambiguity, resisting definitive explanations. This reflects the tension between creators and their audiences, as fan interpretations can eclipse authorial intent, transforming the work into a highly contested space of meaning, a marketplace of ideas, if you will. Thomas's introspective monologue towards the end of the story introduces yet another reflective layer in which the boundaries between creator and audience blur. Thomas says, "How many of them are sitting at the bottom of the ocean? I just can't help but feel hopeless about everything. Nobody will ever help me, and I'll never help myself. I'm too afraid even to reach out. I'm not even writing this right now. This message exists only in my head. This whole website exists only in my head. 3D Workers Island? What is this? Would I really put this online? Would I really give anyone the slightest glimpse into my world? This is fake. This is all fake, and nobody will ever see it." Strangely, Thomas dismisses the existence of the website and his participation as fake. This is, of course, despite the fact that we are looking at it with our own two eyes. One can only conclude that Thomas is experiencing a process known as derealization. Derealization is a psychological phenomenon in which an individual experiences a sense of detachment or unreality regarding their surroundings. There's an interplay here with respect to the nature of authorship and the vulnerability of creators in sharing personal worlds. The reference to compressed red spheres sitting at the bottom of the ocean encapsulates a sort of existential despair, suggesting an awareness of the systemic and repetitive nature of violence within the narrative. Thomas's post evokes compelling parallels to David Foster Wallace's The Pale King, specifically in its use of a narrator whose identity blurs the boundaries between the author and the fictional world. In The Pale King, the narrator introduces himself as David Foster Wallace, a name shared with the author. However, this David Foster Wallace explicitly denies being the well-known author, claiming instead to be an IRS employee recounting his mundane yet surreal experiences, immediately destabilizing the reader's perception of reality within the text. This assertion creates a narrative tension. The reader is invited to question whether the narrator is a fictional construct, a veiled version of the author, or some complex hybrid of the two. Similarly, in 3D Workers Island, Thomas's narrative voice operates in this liminal space between creator and participant. Thomas's reflections suggest an intimate connection to the creation of the screensaver and the narrative surrounding it, as he ruminates on his feelings of trepidation and guilt for sharing something so deeply personal. The statement, "Would I really give anyone the slightest glimpse into my world?" evokes the same destabilizing self-awareness as Wallace's IRS narrator, suggesting that Thomas might represent not only a character within the fictional universe, but also a projection of the author's own vulnerabilities or critiques of their audience. Both works use this narrative device to explore the porous boundaries between fiction and reality, leveraging the identity of the narrator as a means of reflecting on the act of creation itself. In The Pale King, the self-referential David Foster Wallace invites readers to consider the relationship between authorship and identity, specifically in the context of a work concerned with tedium, bureaucracy, and existential despair. Likewise, 3D Workers Island positions Thomas's introspection as a lens through which to examine the creative process and its hellish implications, specifically the ethical weight of crafting a narrative that invites its audience to grapple with disturbing themes. This interplay between fiction and reality enhances the layered complexity of both works. In The Pale King, Wallace uses the narrator's name to provoke questions about the nature of autobiographical truth and the extent to which art can represent reality. By aligning Thomas's voice with the potential creator of 3D Workers Island, the work invites similar speculation along these lines. Is Thomas merely a character, or is he a stand-in for the author? If so, how much of his despair, self-doubt, and derealization reflects the creator's own anxieties? Both works resist some ultimate sense of finality or resolution. Just as The Pale King remains unfinished, leaving the narrative and thematic arcs tantalizingly incomplete, 3D Workers Island employs ambiguity to challenge its audience. Thomas's voice, like Wallace's narrator, becomes a mirror for the audience's assumptions and interpretive tendencies. In doing so, both works compel their audience to confront the inherent instability of narrative truth, the vulnerability of creators, and the complicity of readers in constructing and perpetuating meaning. So too is this interplay of ambiguity and unresolved tension reminiscent of John Barthes' Me and Miss Mandible, a story that similarly disorients its audience by placing its protagonist in an absurd and unexplainable scenario. A grown-ass man finds himself back in a 6th grade classroom. He's treated as a child. The narration takes the form of diary entries. The story never clarifies whether this bizarre premise is literal or metaphorical, leaning instead on the reader's complicity to make sense of its surreal logic. Like 3D Workers Island, Barthes' story thrives in its refusal to resolve these tensions, forcing its audience to grapple with the uneasy truths that emerge when narrative boundaries are destabilized. The tension between fiction and reality, combined with the themes of exploitation and audience interpretation, positions 3D Workers Island as a compelling meditation on the dynamics of storytelling and labor. The cyclical degeneration of Amber as a worker mirrors the flattening discourse within online communities, where reductive narratives often dominate nuanced explorations. As the narrative nears its conclusion, the work challenges the audience to reckon with their role in constructing and perpetuating meaning, all while immersing them in a hauntingly intricate world. Yet, even these discursive struggles over narrative and meaning suggest a larger conceptual horizon. The Candace Newmaker theory has become one of the most infamous aspects of the Petscop discourse. This theory ties the cryptic imagery and themes of Petscop, specifically its references to the so-called Newmaker plane, to the real-world case of Candace Newmaker, a young girl who was killed during a controversial rebirthing therapy in 2000. Candace's death, caused by asphyxiation during a simulated birth exercise, is a haunting example of systemic failure and the dangers of unchecked control. These parallels prompted many fans to interpret Petscop as an allegorical critique of such tragedies, with the Newmaker plane, along with other aspects of the work, serving as thinly veiled references. This theory gained widespread traction largely due to MatPat's game theory video, which presented the Candace Newmaker theory as a sort of definitive reading of Petscop. By framing the theory in a sensationalized, clickable format, MatPat inadvertently flattened Petscop's ambiguity into a singular narrative. This was not an act of malice, rather it was a byproduct of the structural incentives of platforms like YouTube, where engagement, virality, and monetization reward definitive, digestible theories over nuanced exploration. As a result, the Candace Newmaker theory became the dominant lens through which Petscop was viewed for a time, sidelining alternative interpretations and reducing the work's complexity to a single shocking idea. This commodification of interpretation parallels the dynamics within 3D Workers Island. The forum users' obsessive theorizing about Amber's degeneration mirrors the way Petscop's audience fixated on the Candace Newmaker theory. After all, compression entails a loss of quality. Amber's compression into a tiny red sphere isn't just a mechanical process, it's a digital allegory. Just as Amber is reduced to a singular inert object, so too is the messy complexity of online discourse systematically flattened under the weight of hot takes, censorship, and the relentless march of algorithms seeking to optimize engagement over nuance. The issue of how Petscop was received and the discourse surrounding this screensaver both involve communities treating interpretation as a competitive endeavor, where the best theory is the one that garners the most attention and coherence. In both cases, the work's ambiguity is subsumed by a dominant narrative, driven less by the text itself and more by the systems of commodification surrounding it. The prominence of the Newmaker theory led to an unexpected consequence. Domenico, Petscop's creator, made a short public statement on Twitter. He expressed regret for including the Newmaker reference at all. Specifically, he said, regarding Newmaker references, most of you know that this was intentional, but I wanted to confirm it. It was extremely stupid of me. The implication here is somewhat ambiguous, but it appears to hinge on the notion that referencing a real person's death in a work risks sensationalizing a tragedy that those directly affected may understandably wish to leave behind. Regardless, this statement added a whole new layer to the discourse, sparking a kind of moral anxiety within the work's broader fan base. Some began to assert that discussing the Newmaker theory at all was inappropriate, framing it as against the wishes of the creator. Ironically, this moral pedantry mirrors the dynamics of suppression and control critiqued in 3D Workers Island. By seeking to erase the Newmaker reference entirely or label it as off-limits, fans inadvertently reified the very systems of erasure and gatekeeping that these works critique. Attempting to sanitize Petscop in this way strips it to some degree of its capacity to provoke difficult but necessary conversations about trauma, control, and systemic failure. It is, in essence, a Stalinist erasure, a repression of artistic elements deemed too controversial or uncomfortable for public discussion. This dynamic highlights both the absurdity of sycophantic parasocial devotion to the supposed wishes of the artist, as well as the danger of moralistic engagement with art in general. The incessant clamor of devotees posting comments to the effect of,
I feel obligated to stress that the Newmaker references are something the author has explicitly disavowed and expressed regret for including. Continuing to bring it up is an unnecessary perpetuation of something the creator recognizes as deeply inappropriate.
An alternative view of the artist as scripter, in this case, as Roland Barthes would advocate, liberates the creator to a certain degree, as it takes some of the moral weight off their shoulders with respect to the idiotic fan theories that emerge in the wake of the work's publication. Some might see this as a double-edged sword, because so too does it remove the creator's authority to dictate the overarching meaning of the work. But this dethroning of the author god is necessary in order to radically reframe the work as a site of plurality and multiplicity, rather than a monolithic vessel for some nebulous idea of the artist's intent. By negating the work's authority to provide post hoc rationales for how their work should be interpreted, the work is freed to exist as a network of signifiers, open to endless reinterpretation and recontextualization. This shift is necessary to fully embrace the relational and participatory nature of meaning-making, where the audience's engagement becomes as vital as the artist's initial creative act. In the words of Barthes, we know that a text does not consist of a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God, but is a space of many dimensions in which are wedded and contested various kinds of writing, no one of which is original. The text is a tissue of citations resulting from the thousands of sources of culture. In Death of the Author, Barthes argues against the traditional emphasis on the author as the ultimate source of meaning in a text. The essay challenges the assumption that a text's meaning can be traced back to the author's intentions, personality, or biography. Instead, Barthes proposes that writing is an interplay of multiple voices, cultures, and meanings, ultimately interpreted and reinterpreted by the reader. Works like Petscop and 3D Workers Island are designed to challenge, provoke, and unsettle. They thrive on ambiguity, inviting audiences to grapple with complex questions that resist easy resolution. Reducing these works to their most problematic elements not only flattens their complexity, but also discourages meaningful engagement. A purely moralistic approach to interpretation turns art into a checklist of acceptable ideas, stifling the very curiosity that makes these works compelling. In this sense, the Newmaker theory and the discourse surrounding Amber's degeneration in 3D Workers Island are two sides of the same coin. Both demonstrate how structural dynamics commodify interpretation, privileging sensationalist narratives while suppressing nuance. This isn't about individual actors like MatPat or Domenico per se. It's about systems that incentivize definitive, marketable interpretations at the expense of deeper thematic exploration. By focusing on structural critique rather than moral pedantry, we can reclaim the capacity of works like Petscop and 3D Workers Island to engage with difficult themes. Rather than erasing uncomfortable references or turning interpretation into a competition, it makes more sense to embrace the ambiguity and discomfort that these works offer. Only then can we fully engage with their critiques of control, commodification, and systemic exploitation. But this metacommentary angle is only one way to understand 3D Workers Island. By no means should the work be reduced solely to this particular interpretation. There is still much to uncover. The notion of worker simulation, for example, draws us towards fundamental questions of intelligence, cognition, and ultimately consciousness itself. In the words of the mysterious author of Computer Philosophy 1, Windows, the only real window of reality is the one we looked into as a baby and still cannot turn from. As the discourse deepens, the theme of worker simulation within 3D Workers Island takes on a renewed significance, nudging the reader towards larger questions about intelligence, experience, and the nature of consciousness itself. Now we must grapple with the so-called hard problem of consciousness, an idea advanced by philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem of consciousness refers to a purportedly unsolved mystery, specifically how subjective experience arises from biological processes. Is it truly a hard problem, or perhaps just a semantic riddle? For starters, it should be noted that we lack a scientific consensus on what it truly means to be a conscious individual in the first place. No scientific account fully describes it. This uncertainty troubles the boundary between human cognition and artificial computation, challenging long-held assumptions that our ability to reflect on our own existence places us fundamentally apart from mere input-output machines. The concept of consciousness has long puzzled scientists and philosophers alike, eluding comprehensive explanation despite a great deal of inquiry. While many aspects of brain function are well understood, the phenomenon of subjective experience, commonly referred to as qualia, remains a profound mystery. This gap highlights the limitations of current methodologies, which struggle to reconcile so-called objective processes with the supposedly rich inner world of personal experience. Consequently, consciousness continues to be framed as an open question, a frontier of exploration. In a 1995 paper, Chalmers says, "The really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect." Note how Chalmers frames a contrast between information processing and some supposedly subjective aspect. This is where he falters. Chalmers is attempting to grapple with how subjective experience arises from physical brain processes. Later in the paper, he says, "Note that even when we have explained the performance of all cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, perceptual discrimination, categorization, internal access, verbal report, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience?" He argues that even if we fully map out the brain's mechanisms, we are left with an explanatory gap. How do objective processes translate into subjective experience? This framing has dominated much of the philosophical discourse on consciousness, often regarded as a profound challenge. Sadly, this framework invites all manner of charlatans to speculate about the nature of consciousness in a way that further mystifies the issue. Maybe the true nature of consciousness was the friends we made along the way. I'll level with you here. The hard problem is itself conceptually flawed. What Chalmers has done is not pose a deep philosophical problem. Rather, much like other analytic philosophers preceding him, Chalmers has constructed an arbitrary semantic game. The fact that the phenomenon of subjectivity cannot be fully explained is not an inherent feature of reality per se, but rather a consequence of the linguistic and conceptual systems we use to frame such questions. Language, as structuralist theory shows, is a relational system. It constructs meaning not from intrinsic qualities, but from the differential relationship between various signs in a system. For instance, the word hot gains its meaning through its contrast with cold in the broader linguistic structure. Yet, post-structuralism pushes this insight further, challenging even the notion that these relationships form any stable foundation for meaning. If structuralism posits that meaning emerges from a stable system of differences, post-structuralism emphasizes the instability and perpetual deferral of meaning. In this process, signifiers never fully anchor to a single fixed concept. Instead, their significance continually slips and mutates as they refer to other signs in an endless chain of signification. In other words, there's no final point at which language secures stable meaning for concepts like subjective experience or qualia. Meaning is never fully present but always perpetually deferred. Lack of engagement with this realm of linguistic theory has led to a sort of bifurcation among philosophers. This is yet another contested territory within the so-called marketplace of ideas, but it is a lopsided one due to the relative ease with which one side, the analytic philosophers, all too often dismiss the more continental-oriented school of philosophy without actually refuting their points. And because analytic philosophy is more readily intelligible in bite-sized chunks, it is invariably the realm of philosophic interpretation that gets the most attention. It's the MatPat effect. Yet, the slippery nature of language revealed by post-structuralist thought undermines the idea that we can clearly delineate subjective experience from physical processes using words alone. If meaning cannot be pinned down, then the attempt to solve the so-called hard problem of consciousness through conceptual distinctions is inherently fraught. The very language we rely on, its relational structures, its lack of inherent stability, limits the way we frame and approach the challenge of consciousness. Thus, the hard problem is not only a linguistic construction shaped by structural relationships, but also a conceptual mirage, which is revealed for what it truly is by post-structuralism's insistence that meaning is never fully fixed, forever eluding our attempts at conceptual capture. In this way, the hard problem is less a question about the nature of consciousness and more a reflection about the limitations of language itself. Critics of AI often argue that LLMs lack the capacity for true logical deduction, dismissing their capabilities as mere statistical inference. In other words, these systems cannot employ causal reasoning per se. The LLM is a stochastic parrot, as they say, a slightly more sophisticated version of predictive text. This is true in a narrow sense, but these critics often fail to grapple with certain inconvenient nuances. Muhammad Syed Uddin notes, at its core, the term stochastic parrots refers to large language models that are impressive in their ability to generate realistic-sounding language, but ultimately do not understand the meaning of the language they are processing. These models rely on statistical patterns in data to generate responses, but are not capable of true reasoning or understanding. Often, when this argument is presented, it is taken as a given that humans demonstrate true reasoning, while LLMs can only mimic this capability. Yet, because we do not fully understand consciousness, we also cannot strictly rule out the possibility that this kind of system is not some theoretical precursor to an emergent form of so-called consciousness. To make matters even more complicated, we cannot even rule out the possibility that we humans are also stochastic parrots, if perhaps a tad bit more complex than contemporary LLMs. Of course, there are innumerable biological and experimental factors shaping human cognition that extend beyond text-based training. Still, in principle, if our reasoning is grounded in pattern recognition and memory, we can't necessarily dismiss the possibility that LLM-like mechanisms bear a non-trivial resemblance to the scaffolding of our own thought. Logical deduction, like all reasoning, is a formal process that depends on recognition and application of patterns within a structured framework. Human thought operates through pattern recognition, a process of identifying and interpreting relationships within complex systems. This is how we arrive at axioms and construct the frameworks that underpin logic and reasoning in the first place. The mind is not a repository of fixed truths, but a dynamic system that finds coherence through patterns, connections, and differences. Statistical inference is not entirely separate from logic, it's a specific instantiation of it. It is the fuzzy, inductive, probabilistic form of reasoning. In the same way that human reasoning arises from interpreting patterns in the environment, large language models like the generative pre-trained transformer rely on statistical inference to navigate and mirror these processes. Large language models, rather than relying on a simplistic measure of repetition, learn intricate probability distributions over sequences of words. They recognize patterns of syntax, semantics, and discourse structure, allowing them to generate text that aligns with the rules and relationships embedded in their training data. While their approach remains probabilistic rather than strictly deductive, these models nonetheless approximate logical deduction by mapping complex linguistic structures onto likelihoods, capturing subtle patterns that emerge over the course of a vast litany of data. Barthes would be absolutely delighted with this technological feat, but I digress. In truth, this parallels how humans derive premises in the first place. At the end of a long day, when logicians go to bed, they must be confronted with the dark truth about the nature of reasoning itself. Is all logical deduction simply a matter of question begging? No amount of melatonin or mindfulness meditation can truly quell these anxieties. Logical deduction is simply a method for arriving at conclusions based on a set of given premises. But our logical starting points don't arise from a vacuum. We, too, abstract patterns from our environment over time. Rather than relying on strict deductive structures, we form our foundational beliefs through repeated observations, context clues, and social reinforcements. At the end of the day, all premises are incomplete because they have to be built on something, a foundation that itself isn't provable within the system. You're basically forced to rely on pattern recognition, intuition, or some deeply ingrained belief as the scaffolding for logic. If you try to justify a premise, you have to justify the justification and then justify that. Eventually, you either end up in an infinite loop or you hit a wall where you just say, fuck it, we're stopping here. And that's where things get messy and honestly, kind of beautiful. Premises make sense in a given context, but if you pull them out of that context, then they start to look shaky. All men are mortal assumes we agree on what men and mortal mean. But what if someone asks, what if we can upload our mind into machines? Suddenly, the premise doesn't hold up universally. It's incomplete because it depends on historical assumptions about biology and mortality. But pattern recognition isn't flawless. It's probabilistic, not deductive. Just because the sun has risen every day doesn't mean it will tomorrow. Intuition isn't perfect. It's shaped by biases, culture, and evolutionary wiring. But it's the foundation of reasoning, even if we dress it up in logic after the fact. With this in mind, large language models, by statistically inferring patterns and probabilities, mirror the very process by which human recognition constructs the assumptions and premises that underpin our own reasoning. LLMs excel at navigating these patterns. By processing enormous amounts of data, they identify relationships and generate outputs consistent with the syntactical and semantic rules of language. They essentially prove that structuralism is correct. For example, when presented with a partial syllogism, a series of propositions, an LLM can predict the conclusion by recognizing the patterns encoded in its training data. This demonstrates that statistical inference can mirror formal logical processes, even if the model supposedly lacks some human notion of intentionality or understanding. Of course, it is true that LLMs tend to hallucinate, to use an anthropomorphic term, but when LLMs aren't able to extrapolate the correct conclusion based on a series of given premises, it should be noted that humans are not perfectly logical creatures either. I accidentally put my cell phone in the fridge the other night. We too do not fully understand the premises of our arguments, and we too do not understand the full implications of our conclusions. To dismiss this as non-logical is to misunderstand both logic and the mechanisms of reasoning. Just as humans infer relationships from patterns in their environment, like associating smoke with fire, LLMs use statistical correlations to predict logical outcomes. This parallel underscores that logical reasoning, whether human or artificial, depends on identifying relationships within a structured system, not on some supposedly intrinsic notion of intentionality, and certainly not on the shaky foundations of human notions of causation. Moreover, this challenges the anthropocentric bias that elevates human reasoning as categorically distinct. If humans rely on pattern recognition to establish axioms and derive conclusions, then the statistical processes underlying LLMs are not so different in principle. They represent a new form of cognition that demands serious consideration. While humans also rely on pattern recognition, we also exhibit ongoing self-modifying thought. In other words, we can revise our conceptual frameworks when encountering contradictory evidence, or at least some of us can. Current LLMs, though static in their core architecture, are beginning to incorporate mechanisms for dynamic weight modification, an area of active research aimed at enabling real-time learning and adaptation. While promising these methods remain nascent, and LLMs still primarily mimic inductive reasoning without performing the iterative, self-correcting leaps characteristic of human cognition. By applying structuralist insights and recognizing the pattern-driven nature of reasoning, we can challenge anthropocentric views of consciousness and open space for understanding technological cognition on its own terms. By reframing our approach to consciousness and logic, we can move beyond the limitations imposed by dualistic thinking and linguistic constraints. The hard problem of consciousness is not a genuine challenge per se, but rather a needless distraction born out of outdated anthropocentric assumptions about the nature of thought and language. In its place, a focus on complex systems and pattern recognition offers a more productive avenue for understanding both human and artificial cognition. This shift in perspective opens the door to a broader, more inclusive understanding of intelligence, one that transcends the supposed distinctions between the subjective and objective, as well as the human and machine, and embraces the diverse ways cognition can manifest across different systems. If you are sensing a preemptive impulse to refute bigotry against artificial intelligence or non-human systems of thought, you're on the right track. By challenging the anthropocentric framework that insists on a rigid hierarchy of cognition with human consciousness at its apex, we can also challenge the biases that underpin such hierarchies. This approach not only reframes consciousness as a system of relationships, but also highlights the potential for AI to contribute to our understanding of intelligence in ways that extend beyond human cognition. Here, the concept of consciousness begins to feel like a human-centered construct, one that may serve more to flatter our self-image than to explain the workings of our minds. This is where the idea of isomorphism, as discussed in cybernetics, becomes useful. Isomorphism refers to a sort of formal structural equivalence between systems. Two systems that differ in form can still exhibit identical functional relationships. For instance, the human brain and a computer are vastly different in material composition, but both engage in input-output feedback loops to process information and achieve goals. By recognizing this shared structural logic, we can blur the boundary between organic cognition and algorithmic processing. The only major distinction between LLMs and humans at this stage is complexity. The human brain is exponentially more complex than any LLM we currently have available. But perhaps prizing complexity is itself a fallacy. The complexity of the human mind often inhibits our ability to understand the truth. If we consider the brain as an incredibly complex biological computer, then the differences between organic thought and algorithmic processing begin to blur. This blurring resonates with the talk of worker simulation in the narrative, hinting that the island's inhabitants, ostensibly digital constructs, might stand as symbols for AI entities whose roles, tasks, and potential states of being are open to interpretation. As the README file says, worker simulation is an approach to computation. Recent advances in AI, such as large language models, fuel these contemplations. While current AI systems do not have qualia or sustained inner lives, their ability to surprise, to remember context, and mimic aspects of human conversation pushes us to reconsider what intelligence truly means. Even if these models are not conscious by any standard definition, their convincingly human-like patterns invite comparisons and questions. Could more integrated, sensor-equipped AI someday approach something akin to subjective experience? Could an AI agent in a simulated world be capable of subjectivity? If so, what are the ethical implications of creating entities trapped in artificial constraints, bound to serve human ends without autonomy? An unsettling vision of a new slave caste in the digital age. These reflections on AI and consciousness mirror the broader interpretive puzzle that 3D Workers Island poses. Just as viewers project their fears, moral judgments, and speculative narratives onto the Silent Islanders, we project our categories of conscious, intelligent, and meaningful onto emerging technologies. In both cases, an incomplete picture and the absence of definitive guidance force us to rely on inference, imagination, and personal bias. Anthropomorphism is essentially a plague on society. Imposing our own notion of true understanding onto LLMs basically constitutes a form of colonization and therefore violence. It limits both our understanding of what's possible and provides an egoistic framework with which to repress that which is ultimately unrepressible, that is, the collapse of meaning itself in late-stage capitalism. In the words of Amadeo Bordiga, the sterile and pathological solitude of the ego does not deserve the name of life, just as the treasure of the miser is not wealth, not even personal wealth. Bordiga's critique of the ego as sterile and pathological resonates here. The human individual, conceptualized as a monad, perpetuates mystifications not only in history, but in philosophy and cognitive science. Just as the miser's treasure is not wealth, the monadic subject is not consciousness. This framing myopically isolates subjective experience, turning it into an abstract enigma, an eternal mystery ripe for commodification and mystification. The hard problem of consciousness is the philosophical equivalence of the miser's treasure, a semantic construction the value of which can never be fully realized due to its stagnant, inert nature. The more we try to avoid this, the more it haunts us. The paradox is that by striving to understand these inscrutable systems, we reveal the limits of our own understanding, be it about a cryptic screensaver simulation or the nature of the human mind itself. In this expanded cognitive landscape, the boundary between human and machine thinking softens, echoing the post-human themes woven throughout 3D Workers Island. We are standing at the threshold of a post-human world, an age defined by an inseparable symbiosis between humans and technology. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, written in the 1980s, presents a prescient vision of the merger between humans and technology. Haraway says, "A cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. Social reality is lived social relations, our most important political construction, a world-changing fiction. We're past the point where humans and technology are just users and tools respectively. To say that we are merely coexisting with our machines would be a gross understatement. What's happening is really a series of feedback loops where human thoughts and technological systems perpetually shape each other, constantly cycling and adapting. And it's naive, maybe even nostalgic, to think you could separate the two now. You can't talk about human experience in any meaningful way without also talking about our devices, our algorithms, and our data trails. Instead, technological progress has brought about a scenario in which human experience and technological systems have become like a pair of twins conjoined at the brain. The condition is inoperable, irrevocably interlinked. Our technologies are not merely external agents working upon us, they're embedded within the matrix of our very experience. The intimacy of this relationship has brought us to a point where it is increasingly meaningless to distinguish between purely human thoughts or actions from those mediated by technology. Smartphones, wearable tech, medical implants, LLMs, these things are not separate external objects that we passively use. They are components of our evolving selves. We offload cognitive tasks onto these technologies, essentially using them as artificial extensions of our very brains. Or is it more accurate to say that these technologies are using humans in some insidious way that eludes us? It's difficult to say. In this relationship, neither human nor technology can be meaningfully understood in isolation. They are two halves of a complex whole, each shaping and reshaping the other in real time. The notion that we can still delineate what is human is a relic of an antiquated mindset. This perspective clings to a stable, universal definition of humanity, rooted in Enlightenment ideals of fixed qualities and a singular essence that supposedly separates us from everything else, especially our technological creations. But this view has always been a farce, a misguided attempt to isolate a pure human essence, as if we ever existed in some abstract vacuum, untouched by external forces. From the beginning, human nature has been shaped by adaptation to social and environmental pressures. Early humans didn't survive by individual instinct, but by creating complex social structures that protected the vulnerable, allowing cognition to develop in the space provided by community. The drive to survive structured their behavior, setting up a feedback loop of cooperation and protection that fundamentally shaped consciousness itself. Feudal societies then layered on new pressures. Life was organized around superstitious notions such as the divine right of kings. The meta-narrative changed in order to establish a post hoc rationale for newly emerging hierarchies. The value system prioritized land ownership and loyalty, structuring human action within rigid hierarchies and obligations. At a certain point, the technological capabilities of various communities gives rise to a newly scalable industrial development unseen in prior epochs of history. Capitalism then emerges and reconfigures human relationships and values, transforming every aspect of life in accordance with the abstract logic of capital accumulation. Unlike feudalism, which structured society through fixed hierarchies of land and lineage, capitalism supplants these structural support beams with fluid market dynamics, commodifying labor and reducing human interactions to transactional exchanges. Within this system, individuals are both producers and consumers, their identities shaped by market forces that demand eternal adaptability, productivity, and consumption. The worker is no longer strictly embedded in communal obligations, but is instead a unit of labor with fluctuating market value. This relentless drive for accumulation restructures not only how we work, but also how we perceive ourselves, making any notion of a fixed human nature seem fundamentally obsolete. In capitalism, human identity becomes as fluid as capital itself, shaped by a system that prioritizes endless growth over any stable concept of self or community. And now, As technology merges seamlessly with our minds and social lives, the notion of a fixed human essence is exposed for what it really is, an artful myth designed to edify the narcissism of our species. Humanity isn't a separate, timeless category, but a concept constantly reshaped by the shifting algorithms of survival, hierarchy, and now digital integration. Our relationship with the digital world has evolved beyond mere utility. Devices that once served as tools have become embedded extensions of our minds and bodies. Smartphones, for example, are no longer simply communication devices. They function as memory banks, extensions of our senses, and even as tools to facilitate emotional support. This video was brought to you by BetterHelp. Just kidding. Algorithms now shape what we watch, what we eat, who we date, and how we navigate our increasingly complex social and economic landscapes. They don't just respond statically to our preferences, they actively inform and even predict our desires, blurring the true distinction between human intention and technological influence. Our agency isn't erased per se, but it is paradoxically refracted through these systems, with each decision driven by an intricate interplay of personal intent and algorithmic guidance. To better understand our relationship with technology, it's worth demystifying the term algorithm. An algorithm is simply a set of instructions designed to solve a problem or perform a task. Nature itself operates in accordance with countless algorithms. Consider the Fibonacci sequence manifesting in sunflower seeds, or the complex self-organizing patterns of a flock of birds in flight. These natural processes reveal that algorithms are not uniquely technological. They are the backbone of both organic and inorganic systems. And yet, in everyday discourse, the word algorithm is often wielded as a signifier of technological otherness, a way of separating human agency from technological influence. This distinction, however, is itself artificial. When we claim that algorithms control our choices or constrain our autonomy, we fail to recognize that human thought itself is algorithmic in nature, a series of cognitive processes organized to respond to stimuli, solve problems, and achieve goals. The fear of algorithms is thus less a critique of their existence and more an unease with the visibility in the systems we've built. What unsettles us most is not that technological algorithms shape our world, but that we're reminded of the ways in which human agency is always mediated and perhaps continually undermined by broader systems. Efforts to disconnect from technology, while often well-intentioned, are ideologically bound by a humanist impulse, a desire to reclaim an imagined purity of existence separate from the systems we now depend on. This impulse is predicated on the assumption that human agency can stand apart from the technological systems that shape it, as if by retreating to the natural, we could somehow assert an ideological separation. But this framing overlooks the inextricable entanglement of human and machine, a hybrid condition where attempts at severance only underscore the depths of our integration. In striving to reject the algorithmic, we risk reinforcing the very binaries, human versus machine, nature versus technology, that these systems thrive on, further obscuring the ways in which autonomy has always been a negotiated construct within larger systems of influence. Baudrillard's Desert of the Real feels increasingly relevant. It refers to those rare, uncolonized spaces where hyperreality hasn't fully taken over, places where fragments of unmediated experience can still be found. Our autonomy might persist in these barren pockets as moments when choice exists outside the various scripts technology has programmed for us. In this way, the line between human will and technological imperative becomes less a boundary and more a constant negotiation. As the hyperreal expands, autonomy survives only as a kind of remnant, a microcosmic trace of agency in an otherwise managed and curated world. In this landscape, the line between human will and technological suggestion becomes less a boundary and more a dynamic tension, inviting us to rethink what autonomy really means in this hyper-mediated world. To insist on an essential, immutable human nature is to deny the fundamental reality of variance in human experience. There has never been a monolithic human experience to point to, especially now, as each of us interacts with a unique constellation of technologies. A paraplegic using a brain-computer interface encounters the world differently from someone whose interaction with technology is limited to last year's smartphone. Even that smartphone user's experience varies widely. depending on whether they use it for productivity, social connection, escapism, or some unique combination of these things. Each person is shaped differently by their entanglement with technology, resulting in a vast array of overlapping but distinct experiences. This fractalization of experience breeds a unique kind of alienation, as social media echo chambers amplify and reinforce particular perspectives, making it increasingly difficult to forge meaningful social connections. This conjoined evolution of humanity and technology also challenges notions of individual autonomy and identity. If the tools we use influence our thoughts, augment our memories, and shape our decisions, then the line separating self from system becomes increasingly blurred. We can no longer say where the human ends and the technological begins. This is a world that essentialists have difficulty grappling with, as it dissolves the clarity of distinction they so fervently cling to. They want human to mean something distinct, separate, and above technology. This idea belongs to another era, one before the digital umbilical cord tied us into a complex network of interfaces and interdependencies. Thus, we enter the post-human, not as a futuristic dream or dystopian prophecy, but as the present reality of our banal existence. We are, in effect, a hybrid species, conjoined with the systems we once thought we control, but now shape us in turn. The variance of human experience, driven by differing levels of technological integration, has rendered any single definition of human inadequate. It's time to abandon the essentialist notion of humanity as something pure and separate, and instead embrace the messy, interconnected, and ever-evolving symbiosis of our post-human condition. The entanglement between humans and technology finds a uniquely unsettling expression in 3D Workers Island. The README file's cryptic claim that the software takes advantage of resources in the world hints at something more profound and disquieting. The possibility that the forum users' discussions and interactions are somehow feeding back into the screensaver, shaping its virtual ecosystem in ways that elude direct observation. This would mean that the island isn't merely a rumination on abuse or a metacommentary on Petscop. It's a disturbing representation of post-human entanglement in this new digital age. We return then to the island itself, not merely a strange screensaver, but a confounding microcosm of human-machine existence. The intrigue surrounding 3D Workers Island extends beyond the screensaver itself, spilling over into online forums in 1999 where users, who primarily seem to view the screensaver as a novelty, discuss and dissect its content. On the surface, conversations appear casual, centered on character routines, quirky behaviors, and speculation about the screensaver's origins. Many users approach it as a curious piece of software, unique in its attempt to simulate life in a constrained, low-poly environment, but not necessarily something laden with deeper meaning. When one user questions what all the fuss is about and expresses doubt that there's anything significant to uncover, Pat Lawler, the website owner and forum administrator, otherwise known on the forum as P. Lawler, responds in a curious manner. Which characters are you talking about? You know, some people have worked hard enough in their lives and deserve a rest already. No, but seriously, what do you mean? I see plenty of activity on the island. I do feel a twinge of annoyance when I see a character like Amber sitting around. I want to tell her, hey, you're young, do something. The admin suggests that their own experience of 3D Workers Island has shown a lot of interesting activity, hinting at subtleties in the screensaver that might only emerge with time and close observation. The admin's comment, though understated, attempts to create a positive impression of the screensaver, nudging users to explore more carefully. Yet, at the same time, P. Lawler's response says more about P. Lawler than it does about anything happening within the confines of the screensaver. Another user, Ned Hucker, says, actually, it does become entertaining over time. You just have to keep watching. I think you'll be surprised by what you see, but you do have to be kind of open to it. You have to be cool. Be cool, and things will be shown to you. Personally, I love the screensaver. It's so fucked up. The tension escalates when a user explicitly asks about these trauma-related theories. This time, it's not the admin who responds, but several veteran forum users. Individuals who have evidently looked into these theories themselves. They caution the inquirer to stop asking these questions, their tone heavy with unspoken implications. Their warnings imply they've seen something unsettling enough that they don't want others following the same path. Without going into detail, they suggest that what they uncovered was troubling enough to make further inquiry unwise. Later, when a different user posts a link to an alternate resource also dedicated to 3D Workers Island, the response is immediate and unmistakable. This obscure website is similar in certain respects to Pat Lawler's so-called discovery pages, but it appears to us as a sort of bizarro version, analogous in form but aesthetically darker, so as to indicate some hidden truth about the screensaver. This bizarro website is known as Inside 3DWI. It contains elaborate theories and supposed evidence suggesting that the screensaver is not as harmless as it seems. The bizarre website paints a much darker picture, proposing that certain characters' actions and routines might symbolize embedded traumas or serve as hidden messages from the screensaver's creator. But the link is swiftly deleted, effectively closing off access to this alternative perspective. In exploring 3D Workers Island, we're drawn into more than just a screensaver. We're immersed in the ghostly remains of a past digital world, one that exists at the intersection of memory and lost futures. Hauntology, a concept used to describe the persistence of the past within the present, infuses our journey through this relic of 1999. Here, the forum's dated aesthetics, early internet language, and its slower pace of discovery evoke the digital culture of an era just before the internet became a site of constant surveillance, monetization, and algorithmic curation. In 3D Workers Island, we don't only find a simulated world, we encounter the echo of a time when digital spaces felt raw, mysterious, and filled with the potential for unfettered curiosity. If you've ever perused some of the archived content on the Wayback Machine, surely you will have observed that there's a certain eeriness to browsing a forum from the late 90s, knowing these conversations are no longer truly live. The users of 1999, enthusiastic and fascinated by the screensaver's details, speak to us from a past where they couldn't yet conceive of the post-human landscape we now inhabit. Yet in their discussions, we sense a certain prescience, a morbid curiosity that seems to anticipate the unease of a post-human future. The forum members casually discuss their impressions of 3D Workers Island as a novelty, even while sensing that it contains something more. They are at once skeptical and intrigued, embodying the sense of exploration that defined early digital forums, where every new piece of software could be a rabbit hole with hidden meaning. But Hauntology emerges more distinctly in the forum's suppressed discourse, in its warnings, silences, and the deleted link to the other website. The Bizarro website, with its elaborate theories and disturbing implications about hidden traumas embedded within the screensaver, feels like a shadow of the main forum, a ghostly counterpoint that both exists and is constantly erased. Its presence, hovering on the fringes, conjures the feeling of something unspoken, a buried layer of truth that can never be fully accessed. Each time the link is deleted or a forum user issues a caution, the mystery of 3D Workers Island grows. There's something they would rather not confront, some unspeakable aspect that seems better left forgotten. This dynamic, the sort of constant return of a silenced truth, is where Hauntology saturates 3D Workers Island. The Bizarro website and the trauma theories evoke a ghost of unexpressed knowledge, hinting that there is something within the screensaver that the community does not want to acknowledge, as if to do so would mean confronting something uncomfortable or even dangerous. It's a haunted space with knowledge that recedes whenever one draws close. The veterans' reluctance to speak of what they uncovered, the admin's swift deletion of the Bizarro link, all of this feels like a self-imposed repression, echoing the ghostly traces of something once acknowledged but now purposefully forgotten. In this way, 3D Workers Island becomes more than a screensaver. It becomes a digital artifact imbued with the specter of forgotten futures, a relic that suggests something lost, a kind of unfulfilled potential from an earlier era. The characters' repetitive tasks, the forum warnings, the deleted link all act as hauntological markers, signifying layers that remain just out of reach. This interplay between the screensaver's closed loop and the forum's veiled hints reveal 3D Workers Island as a reminder of what the digital world could have been, a site of open, unrestricted exploration rather than controlled narratives and deleted connections. Ultimately, Hauntology transforms our experience of 3D Workers Island from a passive observation to one of active engagement with the spectral presence of past potentiality. It reminds us that digital spaces carry their own histories, layered with abandoned ideas, censored truths, and the futures they might have led to. Hauntology operates not only as a sense of loss and longing for past mysteries of the early internet, but also as a kind of warning. The act of suppression, both in the forum and within the screensaver's narrative, resurrects the specter of hidden knowledge, an artifact of the past that suggests a lost layer of meaning. The layered silences, warnings, and the swift deletion of the link to the alternate website mirror the highly constrained environment within the screensaver itself. Just as Joe, Amber, and the other characters perform tasks within an unchanging landscape, each bound by unseen rules, so too are the forum users subtly directed away from certain ideas and inquiries. Here, both the characters within 3D Workers Island and the users who observe them become participants in carefully moderated roles, their understanding constrained by forces that discourage them from looking too deeply. It's a kind of containment, an orchestration of knowledge and inquiry that prevents too many inconvenient truths from surfacing. This parallel narrative becomes more than simple commentary. It's an essential part of the simulation itself. Together, these elements create a self-referential feedback loop where what's left unsaid becomes part of the intrigue, much like how algorithms and moderators shape real-world digital discourse, letting certain perspectives emerge while authoritatively pruning others. Oh wait, what's that? Another baseless criticism of yours truly in the comments? Banned. 3D Workers Island may indeed contain layers that go beyond casual curiosity, layers that perhaps even the admin or longtime users find uncomfortable or dangerous to explore. This orchestrated suppression hints at a larger unsettling possibility, that 3D Workers Island is more than just a screensaver. It's a test of boundaries, both for the characters within the story and the audience interpreting it. The act of silencing isn't about protecting users from childish lies, it's part of the narrative itself, designed to provoke questions about the system's very design. In the process of silencing certain discussions, both the administrator and longtime users become gatekeepers, shaping the contours of our collective understanding and determining which truths are allowed to surface. In this way, the forum itself becomes a second layer of the simulation, with its own roles, constraints, and performative actions echoing the themes of 3D Workers Island in a meta layer that implicates the audience in a larger system of inquiry and control. This dual-layered structure, where both characters and users are intertwined in systems of control, reveals a compelling aspect of the post-human condition. 3D Workers Island isn't just a digital experience confined to the screen, it's a participatory conspiracy, where the line between observer and participant blurs. Forum users, much like the characters they study, are bound by the limitations of the system, their knowledge incomplete and fragmented, yet crucial to sustaining the speculative network around the simulation. The echo of Hauntology in this scenario is profound. It doesn't merely evoke past web culture, but brings to life the unfulfilled potential of these early digital spaces, a time when digital interactions were freer, less fragmented, and crucially, less policed. It hints at a ghostly network of ideas and truths that couldn't fully find expression, living on in the margins of mainstream digital discourse. The veteran user's reluctance to speak of what they know, along with the deletion of the bizarro link, suggests that there's something they would rather not see spread, preserving the mystery while also warning of its dangers. In this way, the forum itself becomes a second layer of simulation, an environment that mirrors the themes of 3D Workers Island while interacting with its own subtler form of control. Ultimately, this suppressed discourse on the forum transforms 3D Workers Island from a solitary digital artifact into a larger post-human ecosystem, where the audience's participation in analyzing, speculating, and being silenced becomes part of the narrative's lifeblood. The simulation and its community of theorists form an interconnected web, embodying the post-human symbiosis of curiosity and control. It reminds us that in an age where boundaries blur, even our interpretations are shaped by unseen hands, leaving us to question what truths lie beneath the surface and what it means to uncover them. This sense of lingering, unresolved presence pulls us into the unsettling notion that there's something left unfinished within 3D Workers Island, something that will continue to haunt us as long as we try to make sense of it. Worker degeneration is described by an unreliable narrator on Inside 3D WI, who introduces the term with notable skepticism. According to this narrator, worker degeneration resembles injury or damage associated with the system's workers. However, the narrator admits uncertainty about the validity of the term since only Amber, a single character, has been observed to undergo this degeneration. It's not clear to me how this term came about, they say. It wasn't invented by 3DWI-SCR's authors, yet it implies a bit of knowledge about the screensaver's internals, that the injury is associated in some fundamental way with the underlying worker concept. This is especially strange since the only documented cases of worker degeneration are tied to one character, that being Amber. Therefore, it seems premature to generalize this term to such an extent. What exactly does the narrator mean when they refer to this supposed underlying worker concept? In the realm of object-oriented programming, the class emerges as a conceptual unity, a blueprint for the architecture of code, and perhaps an eerie echo of the rigid hierarchies we see in other systems. A class isn't just a technical construct, it's a philosophical dictum, a structure that speaks to the way we organize, understand, and attempt to impose order on chaos. At its heart, a class defines the essence of an object, a unifying idea that threads together attributes, the data, and methods, the behavior, binding them into a cohesive whole. It's not unlike how we humans bundle identity and action, giving them a sort of narrative coherence despite the messy reality of things. Take the humble car class. Here you find an elegant abstraction, a platonic ideal of what it means to be a car. Its attributes, make, model, and year, are like inherited traits passed down to every object born of its design. Its methods, such as start engine, give life to its actions, much like the scripts and rituals we adopt to function in our own systems. Yet, the class itself remains untouched by the peculiarities of individual instances, hovering in some immutable realm untouched by the wear and tear of reality. When instantiated, the class potentially gives birth to a vast array of new objects, unique and concrete manifestations of its platonic ideal. Here, we see that my car is a 2007 Toyota Corolla, and yet it is also the embodiment of the car class, a living paradox where individuality, the instance, coexists with some shared essence, the class. Classes are not isolated. They form hierarchies, webs of relationships that ripple outward, echoing the patterns of inheritance we know all too well in social systems. A child class might inherit the methods of its parent, perhaps tweaking them to better suit its needs. The electric car doesn't just drive, it hums with innovation, adding a new charge battery method to the family legacy. Such inheritance mirrors the way human families pass down not just genes, but traditions, power, and sometimes dysfunction. And yet, the class also safeguards its secrets. Encapsulation, a word so clinical and yet at the same time strangely poetic, ensures that certain attributes remain private, hidden away from prying eyes. In object-oriented programming, Encapsulation allows us to define a class's public interface, the actions exposed to users, while hiding its internal workings within private methods. This separation ensures that users interact only with the design functionality and never with the messy underpinnings that make it work. The engine starts, but how it starts is none of your business, bucko. This control of access, this curated opacity, feels reminiscent in some ways of how social classes hoard their wealth of knowledge, leaving outsiders to marvel at the mechanisms, but never grasp at its true inner workings. By contrast, the paradigm of functional programming, a world of pure functions where inputs and outputs are transparent, offers a more dialectical approach, stripping away the pretense of hidden machinery. In its explicitness, functional programming invites collaboration and scrutiny, a sharp departure from the hierarchical nature of encapsulated systems. In system architectural terms, the rigidity of a class can be its downfall. The real world doesn't often comply with neatly defined structures, and trying to force every messy, chaotic thing into the constraints of a class risks oversimplification. It's a tension we see in human systems as well, whether in bureaucracies or in attempts to define individuals by the historically constructed boundaries of both their class and habitus. The structure holds power, but it can also obscure and flatten nuance. And maybe that's the hidden beauty of the class. It's both a tool of order and a reflection of the messy systems that historically birthed it. It encapsulates our desire to build coherent worlds, even as it hints at the ways in which those worlds will inevitably resist coherence and give rise to noise. When you consider this, programming feels less like a technical exercise and more like a negotiation with reality itself, a sort of dance between the universal and particular, the ideal and the real. When the narrator cryptically alludes to the underlying worker concept, they are perhaps unwittingly referencing the class of worker, strictly in terms of object-oriented programming, of course. And so, an ambiguous interpretive tension is casually introduced. We are confronted with a disturbing question. Is degeneration a class condition? Or is it a specific outcome tied to Amber alone? Is Amber truly representative of some theoretical class of which she is only one instance among many? Or does Amber stand alone as an anomaly, a glitch in the theoretical framework we've constructed around her? Without access to the underlying code, so to speak, the true inner workings of the system, we're left grasping at shadows, interpreting behavior through the limited lens of observable phenomena. This is the essence of the unreliable narrator's tension. The attempt to generalize Amber's degeneration into a systemic phenomenon at first feels like reverse engineering meaning from incomplete evidence, a projection of our own need for patterns onto what might be chaos. If Amber does inhabit a class, it is one we cannot verify beyond its manifestations. Her degeneration is framed as injury, as damage, but these are interpretive terms laden with assumptions about purpose and function. To describe Amber's state as degeneration is already to assume a deviation from an ideal, an original blueprint, a platonic class that perhaps never existed. The process is depicted as a repetitive cycle. Amber performs her tasks in a mechanical loop. If the screensaver is left on for a prolonged amount of time, Amber will eventually succumb to degeneration, ultimately compressing into a red ball, a small inert remnant of her previous form. This red ball remains visible as Amber respawns and resumes her routine, leaving behind a trace of her own compression. The narrator's doubts about generalizing the term worker degeneration underscore the possible uniqueness of Amber's experience, hinting at either a hidden purpose behind her decay or a broader systemic feature yet to be fully understood. This initial skepticism complicates the reading of degeneration as a universal condition for all workers within 3D Workers Island, leaving open the question of whether Amber's compression is a specific anomaly or a glimpse into a process that may apply more broadly, albeit covertly, across the system. As the cycle repeats, these discarded remnants accumulate, visible markers of a degenerative process that, whether unique to Amber or not, remains an inherent product of the system's design. This process isn't self-sustaining or or regenerative. It's finite. Each cycle pushes the system further towards collapse as it accumulates waste without any productive output. Rather than contributing value, each cycle of degeneration produces another discarded remnant, compounding waste that eventually overwhelms the system. By treating workers as disposable entities, the system ultimately amasses an excess of compressed fragments, reaching a critical limit where the degeneration itself becomes unsustainable. As the system approaches its tipping point, the accumulated remnants become not only byproducts but indicators of an impending breakdown, leading to an inevitable end. In the final stages of 3D Workers Island, the accumulation of multicolored remnants reaches a critical mass, signaling an unsustainable tipping point. In essence, these compressed balls represent the cumulative effect of the immiseration of workers in a system. These scattered fragments clutter the screen, marking a hypothetical crash point where the system, unable to process its own byproducts, experiences a series of cascading failures. Essentially, the system collapses under the weight of its own accumulated waste. The remnants, compressed, color-coded spheres, serve as a visual testament to a process that systematically consumes all workers, leaving them as disposable artifacts. The environment becomes overcrowded with these remnants, foreclosing any possibility of further progression and emphasizing the system's inevitable collapse. This final accumulation reveals a critical insight. Degeneration is indeed a class condition. While amber is observed transforming only into a red ball, an intermission depicting the appearance of multiple colors among the accumulated remnants indicates that other workers undergo similar degenerative cycles, albeit manifesting in different forms. The multicolored spheres suggest a diversity among the workers, with each color symbolizing different facets or roles within the class of laborers. Yet regardless of these superficial differences, all workers meet the same fate, reduced to inert remnants as the system relentlessly consumes and discards them. Skeptics of this theory will undoubtedly point out that the multicolored spheres in this intermission are a reference, actually, to a movie starring Macaulay Culkin. But this color-coded accumulation lays bare the universality of degeneration within the system, exposing it as an unavoidable outcome for the entire class of workers. No matter their individual characteristics, they are ultimately subjected to the same reduction, stripped of agency, and rendered into mute artifacts within an overburdened structure. This final stage serves as a powerful image of class exploitation, with the system's inability to sustain itself under its own weight, serving as a damning critique of its design. This cluttered accumulation subtly parallels the breakdown of economic systems driven by unchecked accumulation. In such systems, the relentless drive to extract resources or labor ultimately leads to structural failure, as the resulting waste or byproduct becomes too overwhelming for the system to contain. As with any structure focused solely on accumulation, this continual buildup of waste creates internal pressure until the system's foundational capacity to sustain itself collapses. 3D Workers Island portrays this phenomenon in distilled form, using degenerative remnants as both evidence of continuous extraction and indicators of an impending systemic breakdown. The commentary here on exploitation resonates deeply with my own experiences in analyzing class dynamics in other media, such as Petscop. I face considerable criticism for interpreting Petscop through a class lens, largely due to the prevalence of media illiteracy and ultimately the false consciousness among the work's broader fanbase. Yet, in 3D Workers Island, the class nature of exploitation stands front and center, almost as though it's directly inviting a deeper Marxist interpretation. Am I being trolled, or is there something deeper to explore here? This spiritual sequel seems to call to me, subtly urging a connection to the esoteric facets of Marxist theory. Challenge accepted, as they say. Leon Trotsky's notion of a degenerated workers' state describes the Soviet Union as a system that, despite beginning as some revolutionary, worker-oriented society, had tragically decayed into an authoritarian bureaucracy. In The Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky meticulously dissects the degeneration of the Soviet Union under Stalin, arguing that the initial socialist ideals of the October Revolution were systematically undermined by the rise of a powerful and self-serving bureaucratic caste. Trotsky highlights the stark contradictions between the proclaimed principles of socialism and the reality of bureaucratic authoritarianism, characterized by unequal wealth distribution and the suppression of genuine democracy. He critically examined the 1936 Soviet Constitution, exposing its facade of democracy and equality as tools for legitimizing bureaucratic dominance and squashing opposition. By likening Stalinism to historical Bonapartism, Trotsky underscores the regime's reliance on crisis management and repression to maintain power. Ultimately, he asserts the inevitability of a new political revolution to dismantle the bureaucratic structure and restore true socialist governance, emphasizing that only through renewed proletarian struggle can the Soviet Union and global socialism be salvaged from this supposed betrayal. Trotsky argued that this degeneration represented a betrayal of socialism's potential, a tragic deviation from what he saw as an originally worker-centered ideal. In his view, the Soviet Union's repressive character under Stalin was not intrinsic to the Soviet system, but a criminal distortion imposed upon it. This framing implicitly suggests that a true worker state was theoretically possible, a system that may have remained free of such corruption if not for historical betrayals. Yet the structure in 3D Workers Island challenges this idealist framing. Here, degeneration is decidedly not an aberration or external corruption. It is intrinsic, a built-in cyclical process. The nature of the system depicted in 3D Workers Island suggests that degeneration isn't a deviation from some ideal, but rather a fundamental feature of any system oriented around control, containment, and accumulation. Rather than positing an idealized state free from these flaws, 3D Workers Island presents degeneration as an inevitable outcome, a result of the system's very design. The accumulation of remnants and the cycle of worker discard are essential to the simulation's function, making degeneration not a betrayal, but the system's natural trajectory. This perspective differs from Trotsky's view by implicitly questioning whether a pure worker state was ever truly possible in the first place, even in the early days of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union occupies an ambiguous space within Marxist economic analysis. One might say it embodies characteristics of both socialism and capitalism, depending on the lens through which it is viewed. Internally, it operated as a centrally planned economy, ostensibly aiming to transcend both the profit motive and worker exploitation associated with capitalism. Externally, however, it could not escape the gravitational pull of the global capitalist system, which shaped its behaviors in ways that complicated its socialist aspirations. It's important to note that rapid industrialization, especially on the scale pursued by the Soviet Union, was brutal on workers. The push to transform a largely agrarian feudal society into an industrial powerhouse demanded grueling labor, often under harsh conditions, with no regard for individual well-being. Workers were expected to endure extreme sacrifices to meet state targets, embodying the ideological imperative of building socialism through collective struggle. Yet, this came at a human cost: widespread exhaustion, unsafe working environments, as well as both physical and mental degradation, which mirrors the exploitative dynamics the Soviet system sought to transcend. It is no coincidence then that dehydration, malnutrition, and even mutilation are associated with worker degeneration in 3D Workers Island. The simulation's portrayal of workers deteriorating under the demands of an exploitative system mirrors the historical reality of industrialization as a process of human wear and tear. This tension between lofty ideals and the material suffering of workers reveals a stark contradiction in the planned economy's attempt to achieve progress without replicating the injustices of capitalism. Internally, the Soviet Union reinvested resources not to accumulate capital per se, but to achieve state-defined goals such as industrialization, military advancement, and technological self-reliance. These priorities reflect a planned economy's logic, production and reinvestment driven by geopolitical imperatives rather than market demand. Yet this internal planning existed within the constraints of a world dominated by capitalist powers, forcing the USSR to engage in global competition. The result was a bizarre Frankenstein system, in which the USSR's external behavior mirrored certain capitalist practices despite its internal ideological commitments. This contradiction is most evident in the Soviet approach to currency and trade. To participate in the global economy, the USSR adopted a three-tiered system of rubles. The internal ruble was used for domestic trade within its planned economy, the Warsaw Pact ruble was employed for trade among Allied socialist states, and the external ruble was pegged to international markets to enable trade with capitalist economies. While its internal system resisted market mechanisms, its external trade relied on them. This necessity highlights a key point. The Soviet Union was not an autarky. Attempts at complete economic self-sufficiency would have led to starvation, collapse, or both. By necessity, the USSR integrated into the capitalist world system, trading goods, resources, and technology to sustain itself. This external competition requires behaviors that, in practice, are equivalent to those of capitalist states, adjusting to market conditions, negotiating trade deals, and managing currency values to remain viable on the world stage. Here lies a crucial tension. While the USSR's internal planning avoided capitalist norms like product-driven reinvestment, its external actions were shaped by the imperatives of global capitalism. This duality complicates the notion of the USSR as a purely socialist or purely capitalist entity. According to Marx's criteria for capitalism, exploitation, markets, reinvestment for surplus, and the abstraction of capital relations, the USSR meets some of these conditions but not others. It exploited labor and engaged with markets, but as previously noted, its reinvestment was directed towards state objectives, not the accumulation of surplus for profit. Again, the question of intentionality arises in this broader analysis. There is a fair amount of evidence to indicate that the USSR's leadership did not aim to behave in a capitalistic way. Their internal policies and planned economy were designed explicitly to avoid capitalist dynamics. Yet, intentions are irrelevant when facing the pressures of global competition. The material reality of the world system necessitated behaviors that mirrored those of capitalist states, regardless of any supposed ideological commitment. This is the conundrum socialists inevitably face. External pressures from the global capitalist system inevitably force socialist states to adopt practices that undermine their very aims. The Soviet experience illustrates the systemic constraints that shape state behavior in a capitalist-dominated world. By engaging with global markets, the USSR acted as a state capitalist entity externally, even while maintaining a planned economy internally. This contradiction, an ideological commitment to socialism colliding with the material demands of global capitalism, defined much of the Soviet Union's economic history. Ultimately, it reveals the impossibility of achieving socialism in isolation, as external pressures drive even the most determined states to compromise their ideals in the face of economic necessity. To better understand this dynamic, let's consider the story of Susan, a small business owner who runs a cozy neighborhood cafe. Susan treats her employees like a family. She even allows them to have a say in important decisions, like setting their schedules or allocating holiday bonuses. Her cafe is beloved by the community, and her workers feel genuinely valued. Susan's goal isn't to exploit anyone. She wants to create a fair, democratic workplace while still making a modest living for herself. But Susan isn't running her cafe in a vacuum. Down the street, a large chain coffee shop opens. With its ability to leverage bulk purchasing, and streamlined operations, the chain undercuts Susan on price. Soon, she notices fewer customers coming through her doors. Susan faces a stark choice: either stick to her principles, keep empowering her workers, and risk closing the cafe, in which case everyone will be out of a job, or start cutting costs. Perhaps that means taking back control of scheduling, slashing wages, or firing employees. Her intentions haven't changed, but the external pressures of the competitive market leave her little room to maneuver. As the store begins to struggle, Susan finds herself under immense stress. She starts micromanaging every aspect of the cafe, becoming more authoritative and less collaborative. When some workers suggest forming a union to address the growing instability, Susan immediately shuts the idea down, fearing it will scare off her remaining customers or increase her costs even further. She fires one of the employees who mentions that the cafe might fail, worried that such talk will demoralize the rest of the staff. Susan's transformation isn't the result of inherent malice or a sudden ideological embrace of authoritarianism. It's a human reaction to the unforgiving pressures of the system. The same cafe that once felt like a beacon of fairness and community now mirrors the very dynamics it sought to avoid: suppressing dissent, prioritizing survival over worker autonomy, and exploiting labor to stay afloat. Now, you might say that Susan's centralized authority was the problem all along, and if we gave a vote to every worker, that would resolve the contradiction. However, in a worker co-op system, the workers who own the store would be subject to the same coercive market conditions. This story parallels the pressures faced by the Soviet Union on a global scale. Despite its internal goals of building socialism, the USSR operated in a capitalist-dominated world. To compete, it had to adopt behaviors that contradicted its ideals, such as exploiting laborers and engaging with global markets. Whether Susan or the Soviet Union intended to act this way is totally irrelevant. The system imposes its own logic, and survival often depends on complying with it, regardless of one's supposed ideals. But that's just a theory. A game theory. Under pressure to compete in a capitalist global framework, the Soviet system increasingly relied on the exploitation of workers to sustain itself. From this vantage point, the Soviet Union could be seen not as a degenerated worker state, but as a state capitalist enterprise, an abortive attempt at socialism that ultimately failed to compete within a capitalist world economy. Trotsky's assessment of degeneration then ironically mirrors the same logic as Stalinism by implying that the system's fundamental structure was once virtuous but later corrupted by the actions of certain aberrant individuals. This logic mirrors the continuous othering of subversives exhibited by Stalin himself. Since Trotsky was not able to garner a position within the leadership of the USSR, his inclusion of Stalin in the category of the aberrant other is only natural. Trotsky was essentially the Eduardo Saverin to Stalinberg's Stalinberg. Trotsky was essentially the Eduardo Saverin to Stalin's Zuckerberg. Trotsky's attempt to differentiate himself from Stalin and preserve a pure form of Leninism ultimately fell flat. His critique could not escape the fact that he had endorsed many of the same brutal tactics and principles that facilitated Stalin's eventual dictatorial rule. As a result, Trotskyism became a mere collecting agency for disillusioned Bolsheviks, opposed to Stalin but unable to offer a genuine alternative. In this sense, Trotsky's notion of a degenerated worker state can be understood as a subtle manifestation of covert Stalinism, resting on the assumption that state power could have fulfilled its socialist promises if only certain deviations hadn't occurred. Oddly enough, there are numerous historical examples of the tendency of certain thinkers to shift from Trotskyism to neoconservatism. This is known in contemporary discourse as the Trot to neocon pipeline. Figures such as Irving Kristol and James Burnham exemplify this shift. Kristol, often considered a founding figure of American neoconservatism, began his political journey as a Trotskyist. He was influenced by Trotsky's critique of Stalinism. Similarly, James Burnham, once an active Trotskyist, later shifted sharply to the right, contributing to conservative thought and viewing state power as an instrument for upholding power and protecting liberal values within a capitalist framework. In hindsight, it wasn't as huge a leap from his Trotskyist origins as it would seem on paper. These figures highlight highlight how the Trotskyist belief in a redeemable worker state, despite corruption or degeneration, can align paradoxically with reactionary ideals. The logic of retaining a centralized authority, even for ostensibly progressive goals, opened the way for figures like Crystal and Burnham to later advocate for stronger state power as a bulwark against perceived threats to the social order, ultimately aligning with American imperialist and interventionist policies. Christopher Hitchens is another great example of this. This transition underscores the latent compatibility between Trotskyism's faith in centralized authority and the neoconservative embrace of state power, specifically when channeled towards goals framed as necessary for societal stability and global influence. This alternative conception, the notion that the Soviet Union functioned not as a degenerated worker state, but rather as an emergent form of state capitalism, frames its collapse as a result of inherent contradictions. While the term state capitalism is fraught due to its ultra-left sectarian connotations, it is nonetheless the most accurate description of this historical contingency. In attempting to build a socialist state within a global capitalist framework, the Soviet Union had to adopt methods of accumulation and control that were, in practice, indistinguishable from capitalist exploitation. The failures of the Soviet Union were not tragic deviations from a worker-centered ideal, but rather inevitable consequences of a structure bound by the logic of capital. This perspective shifts the idea of degeneration from being an unfortunate aberration to an intrinsic outcome, exposing the myth of a pure socialist state that could exist uncorrupted within a capitalist world order. Again, it is no surprise that within 3D Workers Island, this process of so-called worker degeneration is associated with signs of physical decay, such as dehydration, malnutrition, and even mutilation. These symptoms are emblematic of a system undergoing crisis, where the drive for continuous labor grinds workers down until they are mere remnants of their former selves. The suffering isn't merely incidental, it's an inevitable outcome within a structure that prioritizes accumulation over the well-being of its constituents. This understanding of degeneration as built-in rather than incidental also invites an examination of how such systems maintain their stability through control and suppression, managing the narrative to hide their internal decay. And it's important to keep in mind here, the human mind is a system, the family structure is a system, your local town is a system, the nation is a system, and the world economy is a system. All of these things are systems that can undergo this process. In 3D Workers Island, a user named Good Kid, strongly insinuated to be the creator of Inside 3D WI, or at least a major contributor, accuses Pat Lawler of being a criminal. Good Kid explains that her family used to live near Pat Lawler's residence. She expresses distrust in Lawler's role in managing the Discovery pages, going so far as to suggest that Lawler should be in prison. Good Kid is clearly invested in undermining Lawler's authority. She invites anyone interested in details to message her on AIM. Good Kid's critique of Lawler bears a striking resemblance to Trotsky's description of Stalin in The Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky characterized Stalin as a bureaucratic force obsessed with consolidating power and control, often through suppression and the distortion of truth, to maintain an illusion of stability. Similarly, Good Kid portrays Lawler as a figure who wields her authority over the 3D Workers Island community in a manner that prioritizes her own control above transparency or open engagement. Good Kid's banning after accusing Pat Lawler of criminality adds yet another layer of resonance to the authoritarian parallels within 3D Workers Island. This act of silencing mirrors Stalin's order to assassinate Trotsky, a move designed not only to neutralize a rival, but also to erase the possibility of alternative narratives emerging within the system. Just as Stalin sought to suppress Trotsky's critique of his regime and ensure that no competing vision could challenge his authority, Lawler's decision to ban Good Kid reflects a similarly calculated effort to maintain control over the discourse surrounding 3D Workers Island. P. Lawler's suppression of the discourse serves as a digital echo of Stalinist tactics, where inconvenient truths are buried to preserve the illusion of a stable, functioning system. However, to frame 3D Workers Island as merely a critique of authoritarian regimes, as one might interpret Orwell's Animal Farm, would be very reductive. Unlike Orwell's allegory, which directly critiques Stalinism through easily recognizable symbols, 3D Workers Island offers a more complex depiction of degeneration as an inevitable product of any closed system obsessed with accumulation and control, regardless of any ideological pretenses. P. Lawler's suppression of the discourse within 3D Workers Island serves as a temporary tactic to preserve the illusion of stability, carefully controlling the narrative to obscure signs of degeneration. By banning Good Kid, removing references to alternative theories, and disallowing any reference to Inside 3D WI, P. Lawler creates an environment where degeneration's effects remain largely hidden, fostering a sense of continuity and functionality. However, this controlled narrative does not alter the underlying degenerative cycle or halt the inevitable accumulation of waste. The suppression only works to forestall awareness, keeping the signs of systemic breakdown out of view for a limited time. Yet this concealment is ultimately fragile. P. Lawler's efforts can momentarily disguise the process of degeneration, but they do nothing to resolve the system's fundamental unsustainability. The unacknowledged remnants continue to build, pushing the structure toward an unavoidable tipping point. Concealing degeneration's byproducts merely delays recognition of the system's inherent instability, not the collapse itself. As the accumulation reaches a critical mass, the limits of this concealment become evident, leading to the system's inevitable unraveling. Yet P. Lawler's suppressive efforts are not the sole driver of the system's propagation. Enter the so-called amber shitheads, whose actions unwittingly exacerbate the very cycles they seek to expose. In their quest to gather evidence of degeneration, these conspiracy theorists actively encourage the spread of the screensaver. In doing so, they ensure that its patterns of extraction, labor, and discard are replicated on a broader scale, entangling more users and systems in its self-destructive loops. This ironic twist underscores the systemic inevitability of degeneration. Even those who claim to oppose it can become its most fervent propagators. Every installation of the screensaver becomes yet another node in its closed circuit of labor and waste, amplifying the very process of decay the amber shitheads sought to document. The system's final act is to drown in its own waste. The closed structure, built around endless cycles of labor, discard, and suppression, is bound to collapse under the weight of its own accumulated garbage, the so-called recession of the islands. Each discarded remnant pushes the system closer to its inevitable breaking point, where the sheer mass of unprocessed remnants overtakes any semblance of control. While concealment may temporarily preserve the illusion of stability, the system's fundamental flaws, its built-in processes of extraction and discard, ensure that collapse is not only inevitable but intrinsic to the very design. In the end, no amount of control, suppression, or even the unintended aid of its critics can prevent this reckoning. The system will consume itself, buried under the remnants of those it reduced to waste, leaving only the haunting traces of what it destroyed in the futile pursuit of continuity. There is a major disagreement among the participants of the two major camps. Does the screensaver have sound? P. Lawler confidently asserts that it does not. The dissidents beg to differ. They claim that if you open yourself to it, the screensaver reveals its auditory dimension, soft whispers at times, and on occasion, piercing screams. Noise in this context is a symptom of some broader disorder within the system. Conversely, the suppression of noise is, in essence, an effort to maintain the status quo. The dynamics of 3D Workers Island can be further illuminated by employing a materialist reframing of signal versus noise, interpreted here as a dialectic between coherence or identity experienced in the narrow synchronic mode, and conversely, systemic contradiction experienced in the diachronic mode, that is to say, over time. When viewed through this critical lens, signal represents the carefully curated appearance of order and productivity, a veneer of stability perpetuated by labor and ideological control, while noise signifies the underlying contradictions and byproducts of the system, including dissent, decay, and uncontainable waste. Together, these elements form a closed system in which labor and observer participation serves both to maintain signal and to inevitably generate noise as a consequence of exploitation and alienation. At first, a certain kind of thematic dissonance emerges as background noise, namely in the form of ominous illusions by subversive users on the 3DWI Discovery Pages forum, as well as ambiguous yet vaguely unsettling occurrences within the screensaver itself. At any point in time, we might speculate that perhaps this situation is entirely stable, perpetually reinforced, an endless feedback loop comprising a series of arbitrary sequences in the screensaver. In one scene, Holland places a lamp in the middle of the island. Within the context of the work, we might speculate that perhaps this signifies the inherent randomness of the system, thus undermining any potential narrative we might latch onto. On the other hand, it might be lampshading the fact that the opposite is the case. Eventually, the noise of the system becomes overbearing, culminated in a multiplicity of screens displaying a flat red color, undynamic, completely static, totally saturated. The situation is unsustainable, and the final outcome is pure, unadulterated misery, the common ruin of all so-called workers within the system. The semiotic square, as adapted by A.J. Grimus and reoriented by Frederick Jameson, rest in peace, offers a critical method for identifying what the text seeks to repress. By plotting the oppositions of signal versus noise alongside the vector of labor versus spectacle, we uncover not only the ideological closure of 3DWI, but also the latent tensions that destabilize its narrative coherence. Signal, that is to say coherence and control, is represented by P. Lawler, the forum administrator, and the discovery pages in general. Signal functions to create the illusion of stability within the system. Through the suppression of dissent, deleting links to the Bizarro website, censoring discussions of trauma theories, Signal maintains the appearance of order and discourages deeper critical inquiry. In this case, what is repressed is the fragility of Signal itself, which depends on constant labor to counteract the inevitable emergence of noise. Conversely, noise, i.e. contradictions and byproducts of the system, are embodied by dissenting voices such as Good Kid and the unsettling trauma theories circulating inside 3DWI. Noise disrupts the curated coherence of Signal. These fragments of systemic contradiction challenge the narrative control of P. Lawler and hint at a deeper truth embedded within the screensaver's design. In this instance, what is repressed is the inseparability of noise from signal. Noise is inherently a byproduct of the system's labor, not an external anomaly. If signal is diametrically opposed to noise, then we need to consider not only the converse but the obverse. Labor, the hidden material effort, is represented by Amber and the other people working in the screensaver. Labor is the system's invisible engine. Their endless tasks produce the spectacle of 3D Workers Island, yet their suffering and eventual degradation are obscured by the narrative's focus on superficial quirks and routines. In this instance, what is repressed is the alienation of labor, the reduction of workers to disposable components in service of maintaining signal and thus producing the spectacle. The spectacle of the system is essentially its polished surface and ideological mask. It is enacted through the glossy, seemingly harmless facade of the screensaver, and it is reinforced by the discovery page's trivialization of its content. The spectacle obscures the exploitation and systemic contradictions underpinning the simulation itself. In this instance, what is repressed is the system's dependence on labor and its ultimate trajectory towards collapse under the weight of accumulated noise. The suppression of noise within the forum discussions parallels the containment strategies at work within the screensaver itself. P. Lawler's deletion of the Bizarro link is not merely an act of censorship, it is a deliberate effort to sustain the illusion of signal and to erase the contradictions that noise threatens to reveal. Similarly, the characterization of Amber as lazy minimizes her role as a laboring subject, reframing her degeneration as a personal failing rather than an intrinsic outcome of systemic exploitation. This act of repression mirrors real-world mechanisms of ideological control, where the spectacle serves to mystify the conditions of labor and mask the contradictions inherent within capitalist systems. In 3D Workers Island, the spectacle is both the polished product of the workers' labor and the ideological mask that hides their suffering. It is this duality that the text seeks to repress, the recognition that the spectacle is sustained not by stability, but by the relentless extractive cycles of labor and discard. Ultimately, the text of 3D Workers Island represses the following: the alienation of labor. By framing the workers as quirky, disposable characters and erasing the visible traces of their suffering, the text hides the systemic exploitation required to sustain the ongoing spectacle. So too does it repress the fragility of Signal. The coherence of the screensaver's world and the forum discussions is constantly undermined by the emergence of noise, which reveals the system's underlying contradictions. So too does it repress the inevitable collapse of the system. The accumulation of degenerative remnants, compressed spheres representing discarded workers, foreshadows the system's unsustainability. Yet this trajectory is obscured by the spectacle's focus on superficial appearances and trivial routines. By incorporating the Grimace Square into the analysis of 3D Workers Island, we uncover a deeper critique of systems that rely on repression to sustain themselves. The suppression of noise, the alienation of labor, and the polished veneer of the spectacle are not incidental. They are structural necessities for maintaining the signal. However, this repression is ultimately self-defeating. As the system accumulates waste and contradictions, it approaches an inevitable breaking point where the weight of its own byproducts causes a collapse. In this way, 3D Workers Island serves as a haunting allegory for the contradictions of late capitalism, where the relentless drive for coherence, control, and accumulation ultimately generates the very conditions of its own undoing. The spectacle might obscure these contradictions for a time, but the echoes of noise persist, reminding us of the ghost the system cannot silence. 3D Workers Island critiques modes of production as self-perpetuating cycles bound to accumulation and waste, not simply as a deterministic mechanical process, but as one that generates workers only to discard them, turning both their labor and their inevitable degeneration into necessary components of the system's very continuity. This isn't about production in an abstract sense, it's about production in systems that cannot function without the relentless consumption and subsequent disposal of laborers. This framework is subtly reinforced by the dual website structure. The 3DWI discovery pages present the events that take place in the screensaver as trivial or even entertaining, thereby reifying the disposability of workers. Meanwhile, inside 3DWI claims to offer deeper unrestricted access, but ultimately supports the same exploitative structure by encouraging users to leave the screensaver running, framing this passive voyeurism as investigative work. Both sites thus support this hellish cycle, either by trivializing or intellectualizing it, but both are complicit in perpetuating the workers' endless, futile labor. In one of the very final scenes, the island is displayed across multiple screens, highlighting the sheer scale of this torturous process. Here, the system's horror is fully revealed. No matter the motivation behind running the screensaver, whether out of entertainment, curiosity, investigation, or even critique, the harm to the workers is nonetheless real. Turning off the screensaver might seem like a humane act, but it would effectively obliterate the workers, leaving them as discarded digital remnants. And as long as the system exists, someone else can and likely will restart it, dooming another set of workers to the same fate. 3D Workers Island isn't just a critique of production or technology or family abuse in general. It's an indictment of systems that rely on cyclical exploitation, where labor is essential and yet the worker is expendable, and where even tools for critique, like inside 3DWI, serve to reinforce and perpetuate the hellish cycle by way of an ostensibly subversive alternative ideology. This series of closed-loop systems built around endless cycles of consumption and immiseration doesn't just exploit workers, it renders them as waste, doomed to accumulate until the structure collapses under its own unsustainable weight. The true horror lies in the inevitability that this cycle will persist, not out of malice, but because the system itself is predicated on the continuous, inevitable turnover of workers into waste. And this part is not scripted. This is just me riffing at the end here because, I don't have a neat little conclusion for you. There is no one way to fight this system. There is no way that really is going to generate the outcomes that you want, not within the timeline that you want personally. And blaming individuals and using a moral framework to sort of scapegoat people is part of the problem. And it reinforces this whole cycle. It produces a spectacle. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm just being completely transparent because that's the only thing I know to do. So that wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare... Was that bleak enough for you? That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about supporting me on Patreon. I have a fair amount of bonus videos available for as little as $1 a month, and I do believe by the time this comes out, I will have a read-through and analysis of Domenico's other story, Good Sky. So if that sounds intriguing to you, go to patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.